Good afternoon. I'm very pleased and excited to be here. It's a great experience to be in Japan and in Kyoto. I would like to thank SISMOR and the Faculty for Theology for inviting me to this exciting conference. And I would like to thank Professor Urayanam for his nice introduction, which I had by translation. So if the translator was accurate, thank you very much for your kind words. A 12th century Christian text describes two figures standing at the gate of heaven. A blind old lady named Synagoga and a young lady named Ecclesia, the church. Synagoga, the synagogue, and Ecclesia, the church. Ecclesia turns to Synagoga and says, "Listen, old, miserable mother, a dry, sterile fig tree. I am not led astray by arid magic, nor have I learned false doctrines, but only the wisdom of Jesus Christ, my bridegroom, that shines for every human being who asks for it. Why won't you remember how God in Jacob, son of Isaac, blessed you and enriched you, and like Esau, condemned you? Are you not Judea, denied every blessing and gift?" The text is a religious debate set as a theatrical play, a drama. Two female characters take part in it, each representative of a collective entity. Ecclesia represents Christianity. She is young, confident, and full of herself. She is the triumphant church. Synagoga represents Judaism. She is old, blind, infertile, like a dead tree, defeated. The young church reproaches the old synagogue for her short-sightedness. She alone is to be blamed for her miserable situation. Why can't she see the course of history? Clearly, the two figures are rivals, and yet, while rivals, they are also family. The family language is apparent right from the beginning, when the young Ecclesia turns to the old synagoga, calling her mother. True, an old, miserable mother, but still mother, her mother. Ecclesia understands herself to be the daughter of synagoga. She takes pity on her mother, but she is also angry with her. These two figures, Ecclesia and synagoga, are common images in Christian art. We find them in all art media, sculptures, frescoes, painted glass, manuscript illumination, another one. Sometimes they are shown as two queens. Synagoga's crown, can you go back? Another one. Synagoga's crown is falling off her head. Her scepter is broken. The tablet of covenant is dropping from her hands, and her eyes are covered with a veil. She is a tragic figure, a queen who has lost her kingdom. Ecclesia, on the other hand, is a ruling queen. Her eyes are wide open. Her crown is set on her head. A scepter with a cross is in her hand. The image of the twin figures of Ecclesia and Synagoga, the church and the synagogue, was a common way to represent Judaism and Christianity, but not the only way. In Christian literature, Judaism and Christianity were often presented as biblical pairs, two brothers, Jacob and Esau, or Cain and Abel, two sisters, Leah and Rachel, or two rivals, David and Saul, Sarah and Hagar. In Christian imagery, Judaism was Cain, Hagar, Ishmael, Esau, Leah, while Christianity was Rachel, Jacob, Abel, the young brother or sister, the daughter or son. Christianity thus acknowledged the ancestry of Judaism as a parent or an elder brother or sister, but this did not diminish the resentment or soften the conflict between them. They were indeed members of the same family, but we all know how difficult families can be. We all also know that no conflict is more bitter than a family conflict, and conflicts over the family inheritance are the worst. The Jewish-Christian encounter along 2 millennia of coexistence is marked by hostility, but also by family resemblance. In a way, both speak the same language, the biblical language, and one may even say that the closer the language and imagery, the harsher the emotional enmity. Judaism and Christianity were both text-centered society. The religious and cultural life, moreover, the very entity, was centered on a text, the same text, the Bible. Christianity, while sanctifying the Jewish Bible, added a second story to it, the New Testament, but looked at the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, for self-justification. No wonder then that both groups expressed their self-identity through the same biblical imagery and by using the same biblical language. Most common in the imagery of both groups is the image of the twins, of Jacob and Esau, the biblical twin brothers, sons of Isaac, mentioned also in the dialogue which I just cited at the beginning. In the book of Genesis, we read that Rivka, wife of Isaac, gave birth to twin boys. Esau came out first, so he was the firstborn and entitled to Isaac's blessings. Esau was a cunning hunter, while Jacob was a simple man. With Rivka's help, Jacob obtained Isaac's blessings, which included the verse, "Let people serve thee, be Lord over your brethren." Both Judaism and Christianity use the image of Jacob and Esau to express the relationship as simultaneously brothers and enemies. In both religions, we are Jacob, they are Esau. Jacob is self, while Esau is the other, an enemy, a sinner, a persecutor. Jews called Christianity Edom, Esau's other name, while Christians turn the imagery upside down, identifying themselves as Jacob, the younger brother, the chosen. According to them, at first, the Jews were the chosen people, but after rejecting Jesus, they lost their special status in the eyes of God to the Christians. As we all know, Jacob's other name was Israel, and this became the name of the ethnic, religious, and cultural entity of the Jews. But according to Christianity, the Jews are Israel only in the flesh, that is, genetically, while the Christians are the new Israel, Israel in the spirit. And as the spirit is superior to the flesh, Christianity is superior to Judaism. Christianity sees itself as the true Israel, verus Israel in Latin. The seniority went from the Jews to the Christians, as it did from Esau to Jacob. The rivalry as to who is Jacob and who can be identified as Israel is primeval, and its roots can be found in the New Testament in Paul's epistles. For they are not all Israel which are Israel, neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children, but in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. The concept of verus Israel, the true Israel, became a cornerstone of Christian theology and its attitude towards the Jews. God's words to the pregnant Rivka were read as a prophecy that foretold the relationships between Christianity and Judaism for generations to come. 2 nations in your womb, and the elder shall serve the younger, as said in Genesis. God's words foretold the future relations between the victorious Christian majority, the younger son, and the oppressed Jewish minority, the elder one, and also justified them. The destruction of the Jewish temple by the Romans and the captivity and exile of the Jews were taken as decisive proof of the rejection of the Jews and the choosing of the Christians. The Jews were defeated and banished from their land as punishment for their blindness and stubbornness, for not being able and not being willing to recognize Jesus as the Messiah. moreover, for causing his cruel death by the Roman. All Jews, those who lived in Jesus' times and those who lived in later generations, were guilty for his crucifixion. Why are you in exile for hundreds of years? The Christian would ask the Jews time and again. What grave sin have you committed for which God punished you so severely? And when will this exile come to an end? Probably never, unless you change your heart and start to believe. Indeed, in Christian polemical literature, the Jewish exile and destruction stands out as the most difficult argument, one the Jews found hard to answer or refute. It was also a cause of the despair that led many Jews to the baptismal font. From the Christian point of view, one may ask, if prophecy and history prove the Christian to be right and the Jews to be wrong, why should the Christian let the Jews live in their midst? Why should they maintain them? Why are they still here, unlike the pagans who were either converted or killed? The answer to this question was given by Augustinus, the great church father, at the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century. Jews must exist in the Christian world because their role is not yet over. This role is defined by Augustinus in his Opus Magnum, The City of God, as follows. Augustine says, "Yet the Jews who slew him and choose not to believe in him, having been vanquished rather pathetically by the Romans, completely deprived of their kingdom and scattered throughout the world, are testimony for us through their own scriptures that we have not contrived the prophecies concerning Christ. Hence, when they do not believe our scriptures, their own, which they read blindly, it is still fulfilled in them." The Jews, says Augustine, chose not to believe. They are blind and they read the Bible blindly. For their error, they were punished by God. They lost their kingdom and are now dispersed among all nations. Like the murderer Cain, they wander from place to place, not finding a resting place. And they are slaves. However, the very survival and the terms of this survival are part of God's plan. They are living proof of the veracity of Christianity. They carry the Bible with them, their Bible, which they do not understand, thus proving its ancestry. If someone were to say that the Christian invented the biblical testimonies and prophecies, the Jews could testify to their antiquity and originality. Moreover, their dispersion among the nations and their enslavement in Christian territories are proof of their error and of the truth of Christianity. Augustine's doctrine of the Jewish witness laid the foundation for the Christian attitude toward the Jews in both its aspects. On one hand, the Jews are allotted a place within Christian society. They are not to be killed, lest they won't be able to provide testimony on behalf of the Christians. But they must also be scattered, exiled, and humiliated. Christians must ensure their survival as well as their dispersion, thus demonstrating their error and the punishment for it. In Augustine's time, it would seem, Christians despaired of the hope that all Jews would soon be convinced by the Christian message and convert. His Jewish witness doctrine should be understood as a theological explanation of a historical situation, that is, the Christian failure to convert the Jews. Indeed, by Augustine's time, the ways were parted, and the Jews remained unbelievers, but this was God's plan, says Augustine, and it had a reason. Augustine's doctrine shaped the Jew as a hermeneutical entity whose very raison d'etre was to fulfill Christian needs. Historically, however, this doctrine allotted the Jews a place in Christian society and secured some kind of tolerance toward them. Although a suppressed minority, they were also treated, not always unfortunately, with some respect due to their ancientness, their books, and their arcane knowledge. Hieronymus, a doctor of the church and the greatest biblical scholar of late antiquity, a contemporary of Augustine, taught the Christians that the Hebrew version of the Bible was superior to the translated version, and that in order to understand it properly, the Christian need the help of the Jews. This is the famous Hebraica Veritas, Hebrew truth concept. Although the Jews belong to the past, the Christians relied on their authority with regard to Hebrew language, to the meaning of the biblical verses, and to geographical knowledge of the Holy Land. In Christian eyes, the Jews were still their father or their elder brother, and their ancestry was much needed, if not always appreciated. Jewish existence and survival in the Christian world depended on a delicate equilibrium formulated by Augustine and the theologians and popes who followed him, in which the Jews were both sinners and sages, punished for the sins but tolerated for the knowledge and ancestry. This sophisticated formula served as a kind of explanatory frame for Jewish-Christian relations, at least until the 12th century. We must remember, however, that here we are trying to draw a big picture, a picture that is clear and understandable. But history is also, and perhaps mainly, an accumulation of events and processes, of many details that do not always fit into the big picture. What prevails, tolerance or suppression, is not only a theological question. The answer to the question can be found also, or even mainly, in political, economical, and sociological factors. We must also remember that a unified Christian society existed only in history books, that there were always several Christianities, and that even within Catholic Christianity, there was always a gap between underlying theological concepts formulated by popes and theologians and ideas disseminated by local priests and preachers in towns and villages. These local priests expressed the sentiments of the flock and also influenced them. No wonder that they were much more hostile to the Jews than the theologians. Thus, for example, when in 1096, during the First Crusade, the flourishing Jewish communities of the Rhine Valley were persecuted by the Crusaders and confronted with the choice between baptism and death, it was the bishops who tried to defend them. According to Christian teaching, conversion should be made out of sincere conviction and not out of coercion. The Roman popes, for their part, were quite persistent in defending the traditional tolerant stance, basing themselves on the Augustinian formula. Many of them issued edicts defending the Jews and condemning persecutions and pogroms. Yet, as we shall soon see, the picture was gradually changing, and not for the better. What then was the debate between Jews and Christians? What did they agree on and what did they disagree about? And in what ways did they express this? For 2,000 years, Jews and Christians devoted time, energy, and creativity to convincing the other party of their truth. With polemics with the other infiltrated every mode of expression: theological composition, biblical interpretation, homiletic literature, philosophy, and the visual arts, as we have already seen. Christianity also expressed its polemical argument in a special genre, the adversus Judaeus or contra Judaeus genre, against the Jews. Hundreds of works, long and short, were written within this framework over the centuries. The Jews answered with a genre of their own, termed the victory literature. But anti-Christian arguments can also be found in other forms of expression: liturgy, poetry, biblical commentaries, and more. Many of the polemical works were written as a dialogue between a Jew and a Christian. In the Christian literature, the Jew asks and the Christian answers. In the Jewish literature, the Christian asks and the Jew answers. In both, the questions are short and the answers are long, and in many, the debate closes with a happy ending, the surrender of the opponent and his conversion. We can briefly and schematically summarize the main topics of the debate as follows. First, the deity. Both Judaism and Christianity define themselves as monotheistic religions, believing in one God who created heaven and earth, but Christianity adds to this belief the mysteries of the Trinity and the Incarnation. God has three persons: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. The Son was incarnated, that is, he came down to earth in the flesh as a human being to suffer and die for the atonement of humanity. Is God one or is he three? Is he divine or human? The gap between the two alternatives could not and cannot be bridged. Second, the Messiah. Both religions believe that the Messiah will come to redeem human being, or at least the believers. But while the Jews believe that the Messiah is yet to come in the future, the Christians believe that Jesus was the Messiah, that he came down to earth and ascended back to heaven, and that he will come again at the end of times to redeem humanity. Third, Jewish exile. We have already touched on this very painful issue for the Jews. Both Jews and Christians agreed that the Jewish exile was a punishment for sins. The disagreement was about for what sin? The Christians claimed that the Jews were punished because they caused Jesus' crucifixion and for their stubborn disbelief in him. The Jews agreed that they were punished, but it was for not observing God's tenets. They indeed sinned, but not that sin. And fourth, the biblical commandments. While both religions are based on a sacred text, the same sacred text, that is the Bible, they read it differently. The Jews believe that the biblical commandments, for example, circumcision and the dietary laws, are binding forever and ever and cannot be changed. The Christian, on the other hand, asserted that the commandments were valid and important in their time, but after the coming of Jesus, they became superfluous, and observing them is even a sign of disbelief. Jesus' grace, gratia, replaced the law, lex, and made it null and void. The Christians also read the commandments as allegories. This reading was in keeping with an overall system that called forth a spiritual understanding of the sacred text, instead of a verbal or historical one. Believers should not circumcise their body, but their hearts. That is, repent of their sins, said Christian authorities. The stories of the Bible, of the Old Testament, are all allegories, parables, and mysteries that should be decoded and deciphered. Two examples will clarify this systematic way of reading. In the book of Genesis, we are told of Abraham, who was ordered by God to offer up his son, Isaac, as a sacrifice. Abraham took the wood of the offering and laid it upon Isaac. For 3 days, they walked to the place that God had told Abraham of. There, Abraham built an altar and tied Isaac to it, but at the last moment, an angel came down from heaven and stopped him. A ram was offered up instead. For the Christian reader, this heartbreaking story was an allegory, a prefiguration, the anticipation of another story, that of Jesus' crucifixion, and you can see this on a Christian Bible Moralisé, an illustrated Bible, Christian Bible, that brings the two stories together. So we have here Abraham. Sorry. We have here Abraham and Isaac with the wood on his back, and we have here Jesus with the cross. And everyone understands that it should be read as the same story. For the Christian reader, this heartbreaking story was an allegory, a prefiguration, the anticipation of another story, that of Jesus' crucifixion. Like Isaac, Jesus too was offered to God. Like him, Jesus carried the wood of the cross on his back to the designated site. Abraham and Isaac went for 3 days to the site. Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days until his resurrection. The ram or the lamb is also Jesus, who indeed was offered to God, unlike Isaac, who was eventually saved. Every Christian child who read the story of the binding of Isaac understood it as actually the story of Jesus. Isaac prefigured Jesus just as Cain prefigured the Jews. Cain slew his brother Abel. The Jews slew their brother Jesus. Cain was cursed by God to be a vagabond. Here God curses Cain to be a vagabond, on earth, just as the Jews are now vagabonds, roaming from place to place everywhere on earth. So these are the Jews, and you can identify them by their special hats, and they are cursed to be driven off their land, just like Cain was cursed by God to be a vagabond all his life. Historians working on Christian-Jewish relations in the Middle Ages would generally agree that the 12th or perhaps the 13th century were kind of a watershed in the encounter between the two religions. While the former period was marked by relative tolerance toward the Jews, with sporadic outbreaks of violence here and there, from the 12th century and even more so from the 13th century, the attitude changed for the West, a change that was salient in all spheres of life. As one historian put it, Western Christianity became a persecuting society. The persecuting attitude was not directed only toward the Jews. It affected all others, Muslims, heretics of all kinds, and lepers, as well as the other par excellence, the Jews. For the sake of clarity, let us focus on the year 1215. In that year, Pope Innocent III, the most impressive and influential pope of the High Middle Ages, convened in his palace, the Lateran Palace in Rome, a church council known as Lateran IV. Some 300 people took part: bishops, archbishops, prelates, abbots, and prominent representatives of the secular world. Several pressing problems were at stake: theological, political, and military problems that endangered the power and the unity of the church. The Pope was determined to defend the church and consolidate it against all these dangers. His overarching aim was to draw a clear border between those who are with us and those who are not, and to secure the homogeneity of Christian society. The Jewish problem was a minor one on the agenda of the Council, yet it found its place in the overall scheme. 4 of the Council's 70 resolutions dealt with the Jews, only 4, but these 4 resolutions had grave consequences. They are also a clear expression of the new winds that were blowing in the Christian world. The second of the 4 resolutions is the most famous. It decrees that both Jews and Muslims who live under Christian rule wear distinguishing signs on their clothing, so as to draw a clear distinction between them and the Christians, and to prevent the possibility that Christians mistake Jews or Muslims for Christians and have mainly sexual relations with them. Other clauses forbid Jews from holding public office, forbid Jews who were baptized of their own free will to observe their old rites, that is, Jewish customs, like eating kosher food, and state that Jews should be compelled to give up usury lest they be denied commercial relations with Christians. Paragraph. A new chapter now also opened in Christian anti-Jewish polemics. So far, religious disputations of both sides were based mainly on the Bible and on biblical authorities. The Bible was sacred to both religions and formed a platform for debate acceptable to both. For Christianity, the Jews living amongst them were the descendants of the biblical Jews, identical to them in belief and customs. Christianity agreed to tolerate them within it, as they took them to be identical to the biblical Jews, those who refused to change when Christianity showed them the better way and had not changed since. But in the 12th century, Christian scholars, most of them converts from Judaism, started to claim that Judaism had changed and therefore should not be tolerated. The Jews, they claimed, did not live according to biblical tenets, but according to the Talmud, that is, the Jewish law, halakha, as formulated in the oral tradition. Unlike the Bible, which was translated into Latin and into other languages, the Talmud was written in Hebrew and Aramaic and not translated into any other language. Thus, it was sealed off to the Christians and aroused their suspicion and enmity. Christians also learned from Jewish converts that the Talmud contains insults of Jesus, his mother Mary, and Christianity in general, a theme I leave for my colleague Peter Schaeffer, who will probably talk about it. The target was mainly Talmudic legends, Agadah, which contains anthropomorphic descriptions of God, that is, ascribe human properties to God, which Christians considered blasphemy and an offense to God. Christian scholars, especially Dominican and Franciscan friars, took up these claims and made them part of an overall attack on the Jewish religion. Inflamed by an ardent missionary zeal, they set out to educate and deepen the belief of Christians, to fight heretics, and to convert Jews and Muslims. Their aim was to convert the world, thus preparing the way for the second coming. Their weapon was preaching. Within a short time, they became the leaders of anti-Jewish activity, formulating a militant anti-Jewish ideology aimed at bringing an end to Jewish existence within the Christian universe through conversion or expulsion. One of the novelties of the 13th century in the polemical sphere was the public disputation. We can take it for granted that Jews and Christians living in the same neighborhoods and doing business with one another sometimes argued about their beliefs, that just as people of different parties today would argue about political issues. These were private disputes, and the church opposed to them vehemently out of fear that the Jews, who were usually more learned, would have the upper hand. Only those who were trained for it should enter into a debate of a matter of belief, said the church. But in the 13th century, a new form of disputation came into being, a public event in which learned representatives of the two groups were called forth to defend the religion in front of a distinguished public and under the auspices of the political reader. Here you have an illustration of such a debate. The most famous ones were in Paris 1240, Barcelona 1263, and Tortosa 1413-1414. These disputations were orchestrated by the mendicant orders as a trial in which the Jews had to answer questions put to them by the Christian protagonists, but could not interrogate the Christians or attack Christians' beliefs. The deterioration of Jewish status in Western Europe that started, as we have seen, in the 12th century, had varied manifestations, like, for example, the obligatory wearing of distinctive clothing or living in separate quarters. The rise of the town and the new flourishing of regional and international commerce brought forth a new commercial stratum that replaced the Jews as merchants and pushed them to money lending. While Christianity condemns usury, the increasing need for cash money in a growing economy was answered by Jewish monetary activity. Jewish money lending became indispensable and abominable to the same degree. In the religious sphere, new devotional expressions that became dominant in the late Middle Ages had serious and even frightening consequences for medieval European Jews. This new form of devotion put an emphasis on the suffering of Christ as a human being and the compassionate grief of Mary, his mother. Consequently, it deepened anti-Jewish feelings as Jews were held responsible for Christ's passion and Mary's grief. The old myth of the Jews as Christ killers now received weight and importance and had an impact that it never had before. This was a potent myth, replete with hundreds of dramatic pictorial representations, religious dramas, scholarly tractates, and all kinds of literary expressions. And it gave birth to fantasies about Jewish evil, awful fantasies that cast their dark shadow on Jewish life and became a mortal threat to their very existence. The most famous of these fantasies was the blood libel, with its multifaceted expressions. Ritual murders, Jews kill Christians, mainly young Christians, boys, for ritual purposes. Blood libel, Jews kill Christians in order to use their blood for liturgical purposes or for sorcery. Desecration of the host, Jews steal the sacred Eucharist wafers and stab or otherwise desecrate them in order to insult Jesus and Christianity. All these libels fall back on the Christ killer's myth that holds the Jews responsible for Jesus' cruel death on the cross. To the 3 Ds of this lecture, dialogue, debate, discord, we can now add a 4th, demonization. Once these libels struck root in Christian imagination, it was almost impossible to uproot them, and their repercussions exist to this day. The hope that with the Enlightenment and secularization, the black shadows of past myths and superstition would completely disappear proved wrong. Not all Christians believed in such myths. Popes, kings, and scholars tried to defend the Jews, showing the absurdity of the libels and calling to maintain the old order, but with little success. Gradually, Jews were pushed to the edges of society, losing any kind of legitimacy. They were prey to pogroms and harsh legislations, confined to small neighborhoods and to certain professions, objects of violent preaching, and victims of forced conversion. In most countries, the process terminated with expulsion. From the late Middle Ages, the center of European Judaism moved eastward to Poland, Russia, and other Eastern countries. But these developments are outside the scope of this lecture, as is the relationship of the Reform movement, Protestantism, toward the Jews. Happily, this is not the last chapter in the story, and I can end my talk with a more optimistic view. In 1961, Pope John XXIII convened a council in his palace at the Vatican, known as the Second Vatican Council or Vatican II. It was time, the Pope said, to open the windows of the church to let in some fresh air. One of the declarations of the Council, known as Nostra Aetate in our age, deals with the relations of the church with non-Christian religions, among them the Jews. This declaration was promulgated in 1965, some 20 years after the end of Second World War, when its horror, especially with regard to European Jewry, the Shoah, had become evident. Here are some excerpts from the declaration. Second and third paragraphs only. True, the Jewish authorities and those who followed the lead pressed for the death of Christ. Still, what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction, then alive, nor against the Jews of today. Although the church is the new people of God, the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, as if this followed from the Holy Scripture. Furthermore, in a rejection of every persecution against any man, the church, mindful of the patrimony she shares with the Jews and moved not by political reasons but by the gospel's spiritual love, decries hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against the Jews at any time and by anyone. Let's hope that this call is answered by all. Thank you very much.